The crash and the encounter. Emma's heart pounded as the spacecraft spiraled out of control. Alarms blared, and sparks flew from damaged panels. She gripped the controls, her knuckles white, but the ship wasn't responding. Outside, the alien planet loomed closer, an eerie mix of swirling mist and jagged, blackened mountains. "This isn't how it ends," Emma muttered to herself, her voice shaking. But no amount of determination could save the ship. With a deafening crash, it slammed into the ground, skidding across the rocky terrain before coming to a jolting stop. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hiss of escaping steam. Emma coughed, pulling herself from the wreckage. Her head throbbed, and her jumpsuit was torn, but she was alive. That alone was a miracle. She grabbed her emergency pack, slung it over her shoulder, and stepped out into the unknown. The air was heavy, tinged with a metallic taste. The sky was a strange mix of dark clouds and pale green light, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. Every instinct told Emma to stay close to the wreckage, but survival required finding food, water, and shelter. She trudged forward, her boots crunching against the cracked, dry ground. As Emma ventured deeper into the alien wilderness, an unsettling feeling crept over her. She was being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Every shadow seemed to shift, every distant sound like the whisper of a predator stalking its prey. She quickened her pace, clutching a metal rod she had salvaged from the ship. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Suddenly, a guttural growl echoed behind her. Emma froze. Slowly, she turned, her breath caught in her throat. A creature emerged from the mist, massive, with scales that shimmered in the pale light. Its 6 glowing eyes locked onto her, and its claws scraped the ground as it prowled closer. Emma's mind raced. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't fight it. This was the end. Before she could react, a blur of motion shot past her. Another figure, a towering humanoid alien, charged at the beast. The alien was unlike anything Emma had ever seen, with silver skin that glowed faintly and piercing blue eyes that seemed to cut through the darkness. He moved with incredible speed, dodging the creature's swipes and countering with a weapon that hummed with energy. Emma stumbled backward, watching in stunned silence as the battle unfolded. The alien fought with precision, each move calculated and deliberate. The predator roared in pain as the alien landed a final blow, sending it collapsing to the ground. For a moment, there was only silence. The alien turned to face Emma, towering over her. His presence was intimidating, but his eyes held no malice. Instead, there was something else. Curiosity, perhaps even concern. Emma gripped her metal rod tighter, unsure whether to run or stay. The alien spoke, his voice deep and resonant, but the words were incomprehensible. He gestured toward her, and then toward the direction of the predator, as if asking if she was hurt. Emma shook her head, still too stunned to speak. "I don't understand you," she finally managed, her voice trembling. The alien tilted his head, as though trying to decipher her words. Then, to Emma's surprise, he reached out slowly, offering his hand. She hesitated, her instincts screaming to keep her distance, but there was something disarming about his gesture. Reluctantly, she took his hand. The alien led her away from the crash site, his movements deliberate but unhurried. As they walked, Emma noticed how he scanned the surroundings, always alert. It was clear he was no stranger to danger. He brought her to a cave, its entrance hidden behind a curtain of vines. Inside, the air was cool, and the ground was covered with soft moss. A small fire burned in the corner, and strange, glowing plants illuminated the space. The alien gestured for her to sit, then offered her a piece of dried meat from a pouch on his belt. Emma hesitated, but hunger won out. She accepted it and nodded her thanks, unsure if he understood. For the first time since the crash, Emma felt a flicker of hope. Whoever, or whatever, this alien was, he had saved her life. But questions swirled in her mind. Why had he helped her? What did he want? And most importantly, could she trust him? As Emma sat in the cave, the alien began to draw symbols on the ground with a stick. He pointed to the symbols, then to her, as if trying to communicate. Emma leaned forward, intrigued. They didn't share a language, but maybe they could find a way to understand each other. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the distant cries of other predators. Emma's grip on her metal rod tightened. The planet was dangerous, and survival seemed impossible. But with the alien by her side, maybe, just maybe, she had a chance. In the flickering firelight, Emma met the alien's gaze and nodded. They were strangers, worlds apart, but in this hostile place, they were all each other had. A fragile alliance. Emma woke to the faint crackle of a fire and the alien sitting across from her, sharpening the blade of his strange, glowing weapon. His movements were deliberate, the rhythmic scrape of metal against stone oddly soothing. The cave was quiet except for those sounds. But outside, the faint growls and screeches of predators echoed through the night. She didn't remember falling asleep. After everything that had happened, the crash, the creature, the alien saving her, her body had simply given up, exhaustion dragging her into unconsciousness. But now, as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she felt the weight of her situation pressing down on her again. The alien glanced up, his glowing blue eyes locking onto hers. He said something in his deep, melodic language, gesturing toward a bowl of what looked like stew resting near the fire. Emma hesitated. The food smelled good, rich, earthy. But could she trust him? What if it was poisoned? Her stomach growled loudly, breaking the tense silence. The alien tilted his head, as if amused, and pushed the bowl closer to her. Slowly, Emma picked it up and took a cautious sip. The flavors were unfamiliar, but not unpleasant, and the warmth spread through her, chasing away the cold that had settled into her bones. "Thanks," she muttered, though she doubted he understood. The alien didn't respond. Instead, he reached for a small device strapped to his belt. It resembled a tablet but was covered in symbols and glowing lines. He pressed a few buttons, and a hologram appeared in the air, a map of sorts, showing the terrain outside. Emma leaned forward, trying to make sense of it, but before she could ask anything, he pointed to a flashing red dot on the map, then to her. Her heart skipped a beat. Was that her? Did he know where she had crashed? "You know where my ship is?" she asked, pointing to herself, then mimicking the crash with her hands. The alien nodded, his expression serious. He pointed to another part of the map, where several glowing dots clustered together, then mimicked a marching motion with his fingers. Emma frowned. "Is that someone coming? Are those people?" She gestured to the dots. The alien didn't answer. Instead, his expression darkened, and he made a slashing motion across his neck. Her stomach dropped. Whatever those dots represented, they weren't friendly. The realization sent a chill down her spine. Was this why he had saved her? Was she part of some plan? Or was he genuinely trying to protect her? Emma studied his face, but his expression was unreadable. She decided to test the waters. Slowly, she reached for the map, tapping on the red dot that represented her, and then gesturing toward one of the glowing clusters. "We go there?" she asked, mimicking walking. The alien shook his head firmly and pointed outside. He made a growling noise, mimicking the predators she had seen before. Then he pointed to himself, tapped his chest twice, and made a sweeping motion with his hand, as if shielding something. Emma's breath caught. He was trying to tell her that the path was too dangerous, that he was her protector. But why? What did he want from her? Before she could think further, a distant roar cut through the air, louder and closer than any she had heard so far. The alien stood in an instant, his glowing weapon in hand. He barked something at Emma, pointing to the back of the cave. His tone left no room for argument. He wanted her to hide. Emma hesitated. Every part of her wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't just warning her. He was afraid. Reluctantly, she moved to the shadows at the back of the cave, crouching low behind a jagged rock. The roar grew louder, followed by heavy, thudding footsteps. Emma peeked out just in time to see the shadow of a massive creature approaching the cave entrance. It was even bigger than the one she had seen before, its silhouette monstrous against the pale green light outside. The alien stepped forward, placing himself between the cave entrance and Emma. He raised his weapon, its blade humming with energy. The creature let out another roar, its red eyes glowing as it charged. The fight was brutal. The alien moved with precision, his every strike calculated. But the creature was relentless, its sheer size and power making it a formidable opponent. Emma watched, her heart pounding, as the alien was knocked to the ground, his weapon skidding across the cave floor. Before she could think, she acted. Grabbing a heavy rock, she hurled it at the creature with all her strength. It wasn't much, but it was enough to distract it for a split second. The alien seized the opportunity, lunging for his weapon and delivering a final devastating blow. The creature collapsed with a thud, its body blocking the cave entrance. Emma stepped out from her hiding spot, her legs shaking. The alien turned to her, breathing heavily. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, to her surprise, he nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement, maybe even gratitude. "Guess we're even now," Emma said, her voice trembling. The alien didn't respond, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a glimmer of trust, perhaps. Emma realized then that their fragile alliance might be the only thing keeping them alive. The alien's secret. The fire crackled softly as Emma sat cross-legged on the mossy ground, her back pressed against the cool wall of the cave. The alien, whom she had begun calling Kel in her mind, stood near the entrance, his sharp gaze scanning the horizon. His weapon, a staff that seemed to hum faintly with energy, rested lightly in his hand. Emma watched him silently, her thoughts churning. He had saved her twice now. First from the creature that attacked her near the wreck, and again last night. But who was he? And why had he risked his life to protect her? Cale turned suddenly, his glowing blue eyes locking onto hers. It was as though he could sense her unease. He gestured to the strange, tablet-like device he always carried, and then to her. This time, instead of showing her maps, he pressed a button, and a hologram sprang to life. Emma's breath caught as the images shifted in midair. At first, it was just a blur of colors, but soon it became clear. She was looking at a city, vast and alien, with towering spires that glowed faintly against a dark sky. The architecture was unlike anything she'd ever seen, all smooth curves and intricate designs that seemed to pulse with light. "Is this your home?" Emma asked, even though she knew he wouldn't understand her words. She pointed to the city, then to him. Cale nodded, his expression unreadable. But then the hologram shifted again, and Emma's heart sank. The city was burning, its towers crumbling as explosions tore through the air. Swarms of ships darted across the sky, firing on each other. In the midst of the chaos, figures fled in all directions. Cale's people, she assumed. Emma's stomach turned as she watched the destruction unfold. Cale pointed to himself, then to one of the ships on the hologram, and made a gesture that was unmistakable. He had been there. He had fought in that war. She leaned forward, trying to understand more. "You were a soldier," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cale didn't respond, but the tension in his body confirmed her suspicion. The hologram changed again, this time showing another group of ships, sleek, angular, and clearly not of the same design as the city's defenders. They descended on a planet that Emma recognized instantly. Her heart skipped a beat. "Earth," she breathed. Cale's expression hardened. He pointed to the invading ships, then to himself, and shook his head vehemently. Emma frowned, trying to piece it together. Did this mean he had refused to attack Earth? Had he defied his people? The hologram faded, plunging the cave back into dim firelight. Cale sank to the ground, his shoulders slumping as though the memories were too heavy to bear. Emma hesitated, then moved closer, sitting down across from him. "You didn't attack Earth," she said slowly, her voice steady. "You refused, didn't you? And now you're here, exiled." Cale met her gaze, and for the first time, she thought she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his glowing eyes. He didn't nod or shake his head, but his silence spoke volumes. Emma's mind raced. If Cale had been exiled for refusing to attack Earth, then he wasn't just a protector, he was a rebel. Someone who had chosen to stand against his own kind, knowing the cost. She couldn't imagine the strength it had taken to make that decision, nor the loneliness he must have felt since. But before she could say anything else, Cale stood abruptly. He motioned for her to stay where she was, his posture tense. Emma followed his gaze toward the cave entrance and realized what had caught his attention. Faint lights flickering in the distance. They were too steady to be natural. "Someone's coming," she whispered. Her hand instinctively went to the flare gun at her side. Cale turned back to her, his expression urgent. He pointed to the back of the cave, where a narrow passage led into the darkness. He wanted her to hide. "No," Emma said, shaking her head. "I'm not leaving you." Cale made a sharp gesture, his glowing eyes blazing with frustration. But before either of them could argue further, the lights grew closer, accompanied by a low mechanical hum. Emma's blood ran cold. These weren't just lights. They were search drones. Cale grabbed his weapon and moved toward the entrance, his movements swift and silent. Emma hesitated for a moment, then followed, crouching low behind a boulder near the opening. The drones hovered just beyond the mist, their beams sweeping across the terrain. One of them stopped, its light focusing on the ground near the cave. Emma's breath caught as it scanned the area, its beam pausing on a faint trail of footprints leading toward the cave entrance. Cale acted without hesitation. He stepped into the light, his weapon raised, and with a single, precise motion, he fired a bolt of energy that struck the drone dead center. The machine exploded in a shower of sparks, its remains crashing to the ground. But the damage was done. The other drones turned toward the cave, their lights converging on Cale. Emma's heart pounded as he stood his ground, his weapon glowing brighter. He glanced back at her, his expression calm but firm. "Run," that's what his eyes were saying. But Emma couldn't leave him. Not now. Not after everything she had just learned. Gripping her flare gun tightly, she stepped out from behind the boulder, ready to fight by his side. The bond grows stronger. Emma winced as she wrapped the torn strip of fabric around Cale's arm. His silver skin was sliced open, and beneath it, faintly glowing blue blood seeped from the wound. The fight with the drones had taken its toll, leaving them bruised, battered, and on the run. They had managed to escape deeper into the planet's wild terrain, but safety was a fleeting illusion. Cale sat stoically, watching her with those piercing blue eyes, as though analyzing her every move. He didn't flinch, even when the fabric tightened against his injury. His calmness only made Emma's hands shake more. "I'm not exactly a field medic," she muttered, tying the makeshift bandage. "But this should hold for now." Cale said nothing. He simply inclined his head slightly, a gesture she had come to interpret as gratitude. Emma leaned back on her heels, letting out a shaky breath. Her body ached, her nerves were frayed, and the alien world around them felt more hostile with every passing hour. Yet she wasn't alone. That counted for something. Cale gestured toward her arm, which had a shallow gash from earlier. Emma waved him off. "It's just a scratch. I'll live." But Cale didn't accept her answer. He reached into a pouch on his belt, pulling out a small vial filled with a glowing green liquid. Before she could protest, he dabbed a drop onto her wound. The liquid fizzed slightly, and a cool, numbing sensation spread across her skin. Within seconds, the pain was gone, and the cut had almost vanished. Emma stared at him, dumbfounded. "You've been carrying miracle medicine this whole time, and you didn't think to share earlier." Cal's lips twitched, just the barest hint of amusement. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was enough to make Emma laugh, a sound that felt foreign after the chaos of the past days. The brief moment of levity didn't last. A low, distant rumble echoed through the air, and both of them froze. Emma's stomach twisted as the ground beneath them trembled. Cal rose to his feet in an instant, his sharp gaze scanning the horizon. He gestured for her to follow, his movements urgent but controlled. "Not again," Emma murmured, grabbing her pack and jogging after him. She didn't need to understand Cal's words to know what he was thinking. Danger was close, and they had to move. The two of them navigated through the harsh, alien wilderness. Cal led the way, his steps sure and deliberate, as though he had memorized every inch of the terrain. Emma tried to keep up, her boots slipping on the uneven ground. The air was heavy with the smell of damp moss and metallic soil, and the faint cries of distant predators echoed around them. Despite the tension, Emma couldn't help but marvel at the way Cal moved. He was graceful, almost predatory, yet there was a quiet determination in his actions. He was a protector, not a hunter. And for reasons she still didn't fully understand, he had chosen to protect her. After what felt like hours, they reached a narrow ravine hidden beneath a canopy of jagged rocks. Cal motioned for her to wait while he scouted ahead. Emma leaned against the stone wall, her heart racing. She hated feeling useless, like dead weight slowing him down. When Cal returned, he gave a short nod, indicating the area was safe. For now. They slipped into the ravine, the walls rising high above them and shielding them from view. A small stream trickled through the center, its water crystal clear and reflecting the faint bioluminescent glow of the surrounding moss. Emma knelt by the stream, cupping her hands and drinking deeply. The cold water was refreshing, cutting through the exhaustion that weighed on her. Cal stood nearby, keeping watch as usual, but his posture was more relaxed than before. It was the closest thing to peace they had found in days. "Why are you doing this?" Emma asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. She looked up at him, searching his face for answers. "Why save me? Why risk your life for someone you don't even know?" Cal didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched beside her and picked up a smooth, flat stone from the stream. He studied it for a moment, then began to carve into its surface with the tip of his weapon. When he finished, he handed it to her. Emma turned the stone over in her hands, her brow furrowing as she studied the symbol etched into it. It looked like two shapes, one larger curved protectively around a smaller one. She glanced at Cal, confused. He pointed to her, then to himself, and then to the symbol. Slowly, Emma began to understand. "You think we're the same?" she asked. "You lost someone. You're protecting me because you couldn't protect them." Cal's eyes softened, and he inclined his head slightly. The gesture carried a weight that made Emma's chest tighten. She didn't know who he had lost, but she could feel the pain radiating from him, even without words. For the first time, Emma saw Cal not as an alien warrior or a mysterious protector, but as someone who carried the same scars she did, someone who had lost everything and still chose to fight. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly, gripping the stone. "If you're willing to protect me, then I'm willing to fight for you too." Cal's gaze lingered on her, and this time there was no mistaking the faint smile that crossed his face. Their bond, forged in danger and hardship, had grown stronger, and as they sat beside the glowing stream, Emma felt a spark of hope flicker within her. The betrayal. The cave was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of Cal's weapon as he stood guard near the entrance. Emma sat cross-legged a few paces away, staring at the carved stone Cal had given her earlier. She traced her fingers over the symbol, her mind racing with questions. Their fragile partnership had grown stronger over the past days, but the weight of survival pressed on her like a lead blanket. And now, Cal's unease was contagious. He had been tense since morning, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon, as though expecting trouble. Emma didn't need to ask why. The drones they had destroyed weren't the end of it. Someone, or something, was coming, and Kale knew it. Her fears were confirmed when the unmistakable hum of an approaching ship broke the silence. Kale stiffened, his glowing blue eyes narrowing as he turned toward the sound. The ship's silhouette emerged through the mist, sleek and menacing, its undercarriage glowing faintly. It wasn't human. It was his kind. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She scrambled to her feet, her pulse racing as she turned to Kale. "What do we do?" she whispered, even though she knew he couldn't understand her words. Kale didn't answer. He motioned for her to stay low, his posture radiating urgency. But Emma couldn't shake the dread pooling in her stomach. This wasn't just any ship. It wasn't scanning aimlessly or searching blindly. It was coming straight for them. Before Emma could process the thought, a deep mechanical voice boomed from the ship's loudspeaker, speaking in Cal's language. The words were sharp and guttural, filled with a commanding authority that made her skin crawl. She glanced at Kale, whose expression darkened. He didn't reply to the voice, but the tension in his body told her everything she needed to know. "They're here for you," Emma realized aloud, her voice barely audible. "And me." Kale turned to her, his expression a mixture of regret and determination. He gestured toward the back of the cave, urging her to run, but Emma shook her head violently. "No, I'm not leaving you." The ship's engines roared as it descended, kicking up a storm of dust and debris. Emma coughed, shielding her face as a squad of armored figures emerged from the craft. They were taller than Kale, their silver exoskeletons gleaming under the ship's harsh lights. Each carried a weapon that pulsed with an ominous violet glow. Emma's heart pounded as the lead figure stepped forward, barking orders in Cal's language. Cal replied calmly, but his tone was icy, defiant. The alien soldiers surrounded him, their weapons raised, and Emma felt a surge of panic. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do something, but she was frozen. Then the leader pointed at her. "No," Emma whispered, shaking her head as the soldiers advanced toward her. "No, no, no, stay back." Kale moved instantly, stepping in front of her. He raised his weapon, his stance protective, and spoke in a low, commanding tone. The soldiers hesitated, their leader narrowing his eyes at Kale. For a moment, it seemed like the standoff might end without bloodshed. But then, the leader snarled something, and 2 soldiers fired. The shots weren't aimed at Kale. They were aimed at Emma. Kale moved faster than she could comprehend. In a single, fluid motion, he lunged forward, his weapon deflecting one shot while his body shielded her from the other. The energy blast struck him in the side, and he stumbled, letting out a pained grunt. "Kale!" Emma cried, catching him as he fell to one knee. Her hand shook as she tried to steady him, but he pushed her away, his expression fierce. The leader barked another command, and this time, the soldiers advanced on both of them. Emma's mind raced. They couldn't fight all of them. They couldn't win, but they couldn't surrender either. She glanced at Cal, who was already moving again despite his injury. He stood tall, gripping his weapon tightly as he faced the squad. There was no fear in his eyes, only resolve. Emma felt a surge of anger rise within her. She wasn't going to let them take him, not after everything they had been through. Her eyes darted around the cave, searching for something, anything, that could give them an advantage. Her gaze landed on a loose boulder near the entrance, perched precariously above the soldiers. An idea sparked. "Kale," she whispered, tugging at his arm and pointing to the boulder. He followed her gaze, and understanding flashed in his eyes. He nodded, then turned back to the soldiers, raising his weapon to draw their attention. Emma scrambled up the side of the cave, her fingers scraping against the rough rock as she climbed. The soldiers didn't seem to notice her, their focus entirely on Kale. Her heart pounded as she reached the boulder, bracing herself against it. "Just a little more," she muttered, straining with all her strength to push it loose. Below, Kale fought fiercely, deflecting shots and keeping the soldiers at bay. But he was outnumbered, and the wound in his side was slowing him down. Emma gritted her teeth, giving the boulder one final shove. It broke free with a deafening crash, tumbling down and striking the soldiers below. Dust and debris filled the air as shouts of confusion and pain echoed through the cave. When the dust settled, 3 of the soldiers lay motionless, pinned beneath the rock. The remaining soldiers hesitated, their formation breaking. Kel seized the moment, lunging forward with a roar and striking with deadly precision. Within moments, the remaining soldiers were defeated, and the leader, wounded, retreated to the ship. Emma slid down from her perch, her legs shaking as she rushed to Kel's side. He was breathing heavily, his silver skin slick with blue blood, but he was alive. "You're insane," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But I'm glad you're on my side." Cale looked at her, his expression softening. "Despite everything," he smiled. The final stand. The air was thick with tension as Emma and Cale crept through the dense alien wilderness. The forest around them was alive with faintly glowing plants and strange, shifting shadows. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a predator, set Emma's nerves on edge. They didn't have much time. The alien patrols had doubled since their last encounter, and the massive ship in the sky made it clear. They were being hunted. Cale led the way, his movements quiet and purposeful. His glowing weapon was drawn, and his sharp eyes scanned the surroundings for danger. Emma followed closely behind, gripping her makeshift spear, a metal rod she had sharpened using Cale's tools. It wasn't much, but it was better than being defenseless. "Are you sure this is going to work?" Emma whispered, glancing nervously at Cale. She wasn't even sure if he understood her words, but her voice betrayed her doubt. Cale stopped and turned to face her. He gestured to the glowing moss underfoot, then to a steep incline ahead of them. He pointed to himself, then to her, and finally back to the incline. His meaning was clear. This was the place where they would make their stand. Emma swallowed hard. The incline led to a natural choke point, surrounded by jagged rock formations. It was the perfect spot for an ambush, but it was also risky. If their plan failed, there would be no escape. Cale reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady and reassuring. For a moment, Emma felt her fear melt away. If Cale believed they could survive this, then she would trust him. They didn't have any other choice. As they reached the top of the incline, Cale began setting up their defenses, using pieces of scrap metal and alien tech scavenged from the fallen patrols. He created a series of traps, tripwires, energy mines, and a hidden snare that he buried beneath the moss. Emma worked alongside him, her hands trembling but determined. She wasn't just a passenger in this fight. She was Cal's partner. The sound of engines broke the silence, growing louder with each passing second. Emma's heart raced as she peered over the edge of the incline. Below, she could see the alien patrol closing in. They were moving in a tight formation, their glowing armor reflecting the dim light of the forest. The leader, the same commander who had fled their last encounter, was at the front. His posture radiated anger and determination. "They're here," Emma said, her voice barely audible. Cale nodded, his expression grim. He motioned for her to take her position behind a cluster of rocks, while he crouched near the center of their makeshift trap. Emma's grip tightened on her spear as she pressed herself against the cool stone, her breath shallow. The plan was simple: draw the patrol into the choke point, trigger the traps, and take them out before reinforcements could arrive. But simple didn't mean easy. The patrol reached the base of the incline, their leader barking orders in Cal's guttural language. Emma couldn't understand the words, but she could feel the tension in the air. They knew Cale and Emma were nearby. They could sense it. Cale stepped into view, his tall, silver form glowing faintly in the dim light. He raised his weapon, its blade humming with energy, and let out a sharp, defiant cry. The patrol responded instantly, surging forward with weapons drawn. The first trap triggered as soon as they crossed the moss. A hidden energy mine exploded, sending 2 soldiers flying backward. The rest hesitated, momentarily thrown off by the ambush, but their leader barked another command, spurring them forward. Emma's heart pounded as she watched Kel engage the soldiers. He moved with breathtaking speed, his weapon slicing through the air in precise, lethal arcs. The traps slowed the patrol down, but they didn't stop them entirely. Kel was outnumbered, and despite his skill, he couldn't hold them off forever. Steeling herself, Emma stepped out from her hiding spot. "Hey!" she shouted, throwing a rock at one of the soldiers. The soldier turned, startled, and Emma lunged forward, driving her spear into his side. The move wasn't graceful, but it was effective. The soldier crumpled, and Emma scrambled back behind the rocks before the others could react. Cale glanced at her, his expression a mix of surprise and approval. But there was no time for celebration. The leader of the patrol was climbing the incline, his glowing weapon aimed directly at Cale. Emma's stomach dropped as she realized the leader wasn't just going to attack. He was going to kill Cale. "No!" she screamed, grabbing another rock and hurling it with all her strength. The distraction was enough. Cale sidestepped the leader's attack, his weapon flashing as he delivered a devastating blow. The leader staggered, but he wasn't finished yet. He lunged at Cale, the 2 of them locked in a fierce, brutal struggle. Emma's hands shook as she searched for something, anything, that could tip the odds in Cal's favor. Her eyes landed on the snare Cal had buried earlier. It hadn't been triggered yet, and the leader was standing directly above it. "Cal," she shouted, pointing to the ground. Cal's eyes flicked to the snare, and understanding flashed across his face. He feinted to the side, drawing the leader toward him, then leaped back at the last second. The leader stepped forward, and the snare activated. Energy surged upward, ensnaring him in a glowing web of light. He roared in frustration, his weapon falling from his grasp as he struggled against the trap. Cale didn't hesitate. He moved in, his blade striking with precision. The leader collapsed, and the remaining soldiers, seeing their commander defeated, fled into the forest. Emma slumped against the rocks, her chest heaving. Cale approached her, his silver skin marred with scratches and blue blood, but his eyes were steady. He offered her his hand, and she took it, letting him pull her to her feet. "We did it," she said, her voice shaky but filled with relief. Cale didn't reply, but the faint smile on his face said everything she needed to know. The reward of love. The horizon glowed with the faint shimmer of dawn as Emma and Cale stood atop a jagged cliff, overlooking the ruins of an old human ship. Its battered hull was partially buried in the ground, its once sleek design now worn by years of abandonment. But the faint blinking light of its transmitter was unmistakable. It still worked. "This is it," Emma said, her voice filled with both hope and hesitation. She glanced at Cal, who stood silently beside her, his silver skin catching the soft light of the rising sun. He didn't speak, but the tension in his stance was clear. This wasn't just a moment of salvation. It was a moment of decision. Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions inside her. They had survived so much together. The creatures, the soldiers, the betrayal. And now, after all of it, freedom was finally within reach. But freedom came with a cost. Cale gestured toward the ship, pointing to the transmitter. He then mimicked the motion of a ship taking off, followed by a sharp shake of his head. His meaning was clear. This was her way off the planet, but it wasn't his. "No," Emma said, shaking her head. "I'm not leaving you here." Cal's glowing blue eyes softened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stepped closer, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. He pointed to her, then to the sky, and finally made a protective gesture over his heart. He was telling her she needed to go, that her survival mattered more than anything else. Tears welled up in Emma's eyes. "Don't you understand? I can't just abandon you. You saved my life, over and over again. You fought for me when no one else would. You?" Her voice broke, and she looked away, unable to finish. Cale stepped in front of her, tilting his head slightly to meet her gaze. His expression was calm, steady, but his eyes held a depth of emotion that words could never convey. He reached into the pouch on his belt and pulled out a small round object, a holographic projector. With a flick of his wrist, it activated, displaying an image of his homeworld. The once beautiful spires, now charred and broken, flickered in the air. Cale pointed to the image, then to himself, and finally to her. Emma understood instantly. He was saying that his home was gone, but she was his home now. The realization sent a fresh wave of tears streaming down her face. "You don't have to stay here," she said, her voice trembling. "We can find a way. Together." Cale hesitated, his gaze flicking back toward the distant sky. He knew the truth she was too afraid to admit. Even if they left the planet, the universe would never accept him. He would always be hunted, always be seen as a threat. But Emma's determination burned like a beacon, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Cale dared to hope. The distant hum of engines snapped them both to attention. Emma turned to see a ship descending toward the old wreck, a human rescue vessel. Her emergency signal had been received. "They're here," she whispered, her stomach tightening with a mix of relief and dread. She looked at Cale, her heart breaking. "Please, come with me." Cale remained silent, his expression torn. He reached for the holographic projector again, this time displaying an image of the two of them standing side by side. It wasn't real, but it was what he imagined, a future where they were together, safe. He placed the device in her hand, curling her fingers around it. His meaning was clear. He wanted her to remember him, no matter what happened next. The rescue ship landed with a hiss of steam, and a team of humans in sleek, armored suits emerged, their weapons raised. Emma stepped forward, raising her hands to show she wasn't a threat. "I'm Emma Carter," she called out. "I'm the one who sent the distress signal." The team leader nodded but kept his gaze locked on Cale. "And him? Is he hostile?" Emma's heart raced. "No, he saved me. He's the reason I'm alive." The leader exchanged a look with his team, then addressed Cale directly. "You'll have to disarm, and come quietly if you want to board." Cale didn't move. His glowing eyes flicked to Emma, filled with unspoken words. She could see the struggle within him, the desire to stay by her side clashing with the knowledge that his presence could put her in danger. Finally, he stepped forward and dropped his weapon to the ground, his hands raised. Emma's breath caught as the team moved cautiously toward him. She wanted to scream, to tell them to back off, but she forced herself to stay calm. Cale was trusting her, and she had to trust him too. As they boarded the rescue ship, Emma sat beside Cale, her hand resting on his. The crew watched him warily, but Cale didn't react. His focus remained on Emma, his calm presence grounding her. As the ship ascended, leaving the hostile planet behind, Emma felt a mix of relief and sadness. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She and Cale would face it together. Against all odds, they had found something rare and precious, a bond that transcended worlds. Cale turned to her, his lips curving into a faint smile. For the first time, he spoke a single word in her language, his voice deep and resonant. "Home."